Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Currey, coming to you from Iowa State University down here in Ames, Iowa. I hope you're all doing well. I wish we could all be in the same room together, but I'm glad to be on the same screen or the same wavelength with you. Today, I want to talk a little bit about finishing fertilizer programs. And it's going to be with an emphasis on controlling growth and maintaining a green appearance. And it's going to lean heavily towards those spring crop production runs like annual bedding plants and perennial bedding plants. So why do I want to talk about post-transplant or finishing fertilization? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, fertilizers can be a broad subject, okay? So one of the things that I like to do is to try and focus on those parts of fertilization that are going to be most impactful to any production program. That's why I like to focus on mineral nutrition that can help control the growth of our plants and control that size of the plant in its container, as well as the appearance of the plant by maintaining attractive, marketable foliage. Now, there are absolutely many facets to nutrition. You could really go down a rabbit hole with fertilizing greenhouse crops. However, for spring crops, we really want to try and narrow down the different things we're focusing on. Again, we're going to have so many different crops when you think about spring. Diversity is really the theme of spring crop production. There are so many different species and cultivars of annual bedding plants and herbaceous perennials that can be really challenging to try and accommodate each individual species. That's why we want to try and focus on what's going to be the most impactful for our overall crop production. So I like to focus on three things when I'm looking at my post-transplant or finishing fertilization program. First is going to be the nitrogen rate. Second is going to be the phosphorus rate. And third is going to be the micronutrients. And we really can't separate that from substrate pH, so I lump pH in with micronutrients. Now, when we look at these three things, nitrogen rate, phosphorus rate, and the micronutrients, we talk about the goals of this talk. Really, the nitrogen and phosphorus rates are going to affect the growth, or is going to be used to control growth, whereas the micronutrient rates, or managing substrate pH, is going to have a marked effect on the appearance or the greenness of our crops. So we're going to go ahead and get started with nitrogen, okay? Now, there are 12 different essential macro and micronutrients. Nitrogen is going to be the nutrient that is going to be most associated with growth. It is taken up in the greatest quantity of plants within a plant, but it's also going to be having the greatest effect on the vegetative growth, the size, the weight of plants. Now, the nitrogen fertilization rate that we select is going to vary with crops. We have some crops that are light feeders and do not require much nitrogen, and we have some crops that are considered heavier feeders and have more nitrogen. But the general response to nitrogen is going to be similar across all different crops. So let's start here taking a look at zonal geranium. You can see that as the nitrogen concentration increases from 0 parts per million, growth increases up to about 200 to 300 parts per million. Then you can see that at 400 parts per million, we've got a small stunted plant, likely from salt stress, from being fertilized too much. So again, that general response to fertilization is that growth increases with fertilization when you start from an unfertilized plant until you hit a maximum growth rate with a specific fertilizer concentration. And then we start to see a decline in growth with an increasing fertilizer concentration. That's again going to be due to salt stress. Here we have Dahlia, and you can see that same trend. Growth increases to a maximum, then it decreases after that optimum. And finally, we've got Verbena, and again, that growth response increasing with increasing fertilization, nitrogen concentration, is apparent here, up to about 300 to 400 parts per million. Now, let's go back to how we classify our crops. Like I said, we can classify crops based on their fertilizer requirement from light feeders, moderate feeders, and heavy feeders. And a lot of that is going to be based around what fertilizer concentration gives you that greatest plant growth, or the largest plant. That's going to be what's considered optimal. So let's look at what's recommended here from different companies for interspecific geraniums. Okay, and that was the first example that you saw in those images. So company A on the top, you see they're recommending 250 parts per million nitrogen. Company B in the middle, they're recommending from between 225 parts per million up to 300 parts per million nitrogen. And company C is recommending from 125 to 200 parts per million nitrogen. Generally, interspecific geraniums are classified as a heavy feeding crop. Here we see the recommendations for vegetatively propagated petunias. And again, they're fairly similar to those recommendations for geraniums. Company A, 250 to 300 parts per million nitrogen. Company B, 225 to 300 parts per million nitrogen. And Company C, 200 to 250 parts per million nitrogen. So the question is, are these nitrogen rates that we would consider optimal actually necessary in order to finish or produce high quality bedding plants? I do not believe so. When we go back to look at those earlier slides, we can fertilize crops at concentrations that are less than those optimal rates, and we still get a nice, healthy appearing plant, but not without necessarily that maximum size growth that we're trying to control. So some considerations for nitrogen reduction. I think a good place to start is on the lower end of water-soluble fertilizer at 100 parts per million nitrogen. For the vegetatively propagated crops that we have finished in our greenhouse in this research, we didn't find really any negative effect on flowering. We saw a reduction in unwanted growth, and again, it produced more compact plants that would result in less PGR use, but we also didn't see any visible nutrient deficiencies. When you think of a plant that is deficient in nitrogen, the most obvious symptom of that is going to be yellowing lower leaves. That would render a plant unmarketable, but even at the reduced fertilizer concentrations I'm recommending, around 100 parts per million for these vegetatively propagated crops, you can get by and have no visible nitrogen deficiency. You also may be able to get water-soluble fertilizer concentrations as low as 50 to 75 parts per million, depending on the species and your frequency of irrigation. Now, if you're going to go this low, definitely trial this first. This is going to be much better suited for a low to no leach irrigation situation where you're going to be minimizing the leachate of any of the fertilizer. Another thing to consider is using a combination program where you use a low water-soluble fertilizer concentration, such as 50 to 75 parts per million nitrogen, along with the low controlled release fertilizer rate from anywhere from 1 to 2 pounds per cubic yard of controlled release fertilizer. With controlled release fertilizer, you don't see that push in vegetative growth that results in bigger plants that we saw with increasing concentrations of water-soluble fertilizer. Then you can add the low concentrations of water-soluble fertilizer to give the plants the added nutrition to make sure they maintain adequate size and appearance as necessary. All right, we talked about using nitrogen to control growth. Now let's go ahead and move on into phosphorus, another one of our primary macronutrients. When we look at growing seedling plugs, using low concentrations of phosphorus or using phosphorus restriction is now a standard and well-accepted practice. The reason is that for these young plugs, when you use low phosphorus fertilization, you get less stem stretch and you get less unwanted stem elongation. Now, while it's a very widely accepted practice in growing seedling plugs to reduce phosphorus, we also wanted to look at using phosphorus restriction for controlling the growth of containerized crops during finishing. And yes, it does work. We can modify the phosphorus concentration during finishing to help inhibit unwanted or excessive plant stretch. So let's take a look at some examples. Now, in the examples, to keep in mind, there are several reasons why we want to or what we need to be considerate of when we're using phosphorus. We need to make sure our plants have adequate foliage appearance, no deficient signs. We want to make sure that they flower on time, and that they have adequate flower numbers. And we also want to make sure that it's easy to implement. And so we'll cover all those topics in this section of the talk, talking about phosphorus. Here, we'll start out with a potted plant. Here we have some florist chrysanthemums that were grown in 6-inch pots in the greenhouse. I want to start it out here because this is a long-term flowering potted plant, and we can take a look at what the long-term effects of phosphorus concentration have. So when you look at these chrysanthemums, you can see that they were provided with 0, 5, 10, 20, or 40 parts per million of phosphorus during production. Now, this was provided at every fertilization because we mixed up a water-soluble fertilizer. Now, when we look at these concentrations, phosphorus was the only nutrient that was changed. We did not manipulate the nitrogen concentration or the micronutrient concentrations. It was only the phosphorus that was varying, so all the other nutrients were equal across treatments. You can see that the plant that was not provided with any phosphorus, 0 on the left-hand side, doesn't look appealing. You can see that there's visible phosphorus deficiency signs on the leaves with that marginal necrosis, and the plant also looks relatively stunted. Now, on the other hand, you can see that that plant provided with 40 parts per million is large, too large in fact. We used no plant growth regulators on this crop. And so while that did produce the maximum or fullest growth, we're trying to generally control the size of plants that are grown in containers, whether it's a potted plant or an annual perennial bedding plant. So when you look at those mums that were provided with 5 or 10 parts per million phosphorus, you can see that compared to the 40 parts per million phosphorus, they still have equally as healthy foliage. They're covered in flowers. They're just a smaller plant. They're shorter and they're not as wide, and they're a little bit tighter in growth. So, but they're not too small to be marketed. In fact, they're highly marketable with respect to their size. Those plants that were provided with 40 parts per million would be considered too large and floppy for the container. So now let's take a look at bedding plants provided with that same range of phosphorus. Here we have zonal geraniums, and these cuttings were transplanted into containers, 4.5-inch containers, and then again provided with 150 parts per million nitrogen across all treatments, but we varied the phosphorus concentration. And again, compared to those plants receiving 10 to 40 parts per million, you see that the plant provided with 5 parts per million phosphorus still looks very healthy, is flowering, but it doesn't have quite as much growth, and it's resulting in a tighter, more compact plant. If you look at the plant that was provided with no phosphorus, you actually got great growth control, except you can see that there's a little bit of marginal deficiency symptoms on the lower leaves. Although all things equal, that's not that bad compared to the chrysanthemum in the previous photo. Here's an example with a vegetatively propagated petunia. In this case, we found that plants provided with no phosphorus looked completely healthy, had large flower numbers and flower on time, and they had no signs of deficiency, but they were good and tight. Again, very compact plants compared to, again, plants provided with that 10, 20, or 40 parts per million. So in this case, we found that we didn't even have to provide phosphorus for our plants. So clearly, for annual bedding plants, looking at 0, 5, 10 parts per million phosphorus is a good range. I'd focus more in the 2.5 to 5 part per million range for finishing. Now, one thing that you have to consider with some of your crops that you're finishing is that you can't use growth regulators, specifically for those edible bedding plants, such as culinary herbs or vegetables like tomatoes and peppers. There is some use for uniconazole or Sumagic on tomato and pepper and eggplant plugs, but it can only be used in the phases of production when they're more juvenile, and you can only use a certain cumulative amount. So for all intents and purposes, you have no real growth regulator options for finishing your vegetable and herbs. So that's why we want to try and look at phosphorus restriction or phosphorus reduction, again, to try and control growth for these edible crops. So are there downsides to phosphorus restriction? Absolutely, we saw some. While the chrysanthemum that we saw had phosphorus deficiency signs that ended up in necrotic leaves, you can also get leaf purpling, such as the petunia in this example. You may have seen purpling in leaves of plugs, and this is again because plugs are commonly grown with low phosphorus. And you'll notice that when those purple-leafed plugs are transplanted, they'll grow out of it. Now, when annuals and perennials have a little bit of this leaf purpling, they will generally grow out of this fairly quickly after transplanting into gardens due to phosphorus concentrations that are available in the soils. They're going to help replenish that plant and make it adequate right away. Now, the purpling might reduce the marketability on the plants depending on how widespread it is. If it's not too much, it usually doesn't have much of an effect. Where you definitely don't want to use this is for flowering potted plants, because the flowering potted plants are just going to sit on a deck or a patio or inside someone's house. They're not going to be transplanted and access more phosphorus, so they're not going to grow out of that purple leaf sign symptomology. So one of the things, again, I mentioned earlier is that we want phosphorus restriction to be easy. One of the things you can do is simply select fertilizer formulations that have less phosphorus. You can take a triple 20, 20, 20, 20, and compare that to a 13, 2, 13. You can see that the proportion of phosphorus, the middle number, relative to nitrogen, the first number, is much less in that 13, 2, 13 example. So simply by selecting different fertilizers, we can reduce the amount of phosphorus. Now remember that your phosphorus concentration is going to be fixed to your nitrogen concentration. So when you raise or lower your nitrogen concentration in these one bag mixes, it's going to be changing your phosphorus concentration too. A little more advanced solution to the problem, but still something that I think is pretty easy, is to do a two-part fertilizer system. You can have one fertilizer injector that's providing fertilizer that doesn't have any phosphorus, and then you can have a second injector that's providing monopotassium phosphate in order to provide that phosphorus to your plants at any concentration. So this is something where you could take a 15-0-15 fertilizer or a 20-0-20 fertilizer with micronutrients in one injector, set your nitrogen rate, and then you could have in that second injector monopotassium phosphate that's going to be injecting anywhere from 2.5 to 10 parts per million phosphorus. The reason this is great is that your phosphorus is not fixed to your nitrogen concentration. So you can have more or less nitrogen or more or less phosphorus and control them independently, not in a fixed ratio with each other. So while we want to try and focus on using nitrogen and phosphorus to control our finishing growth, we may still need to use plant growth regulators. So I just wanted to quick add this in here because we're trying to use fertilizer control growth, but we might need a little more control. When we talk about plant growth retardants, we need to know the activity of the residual activity. What happens after you spray it? And you can see here in this chart, we've got all the different PGRs, and they have residual activities ranging from short to very long. When we're looking at PGRs that we want to use in finishing of annual and perennial bedding plants, just for light growth control, we want to focus on those PGRs that have short to moderate activity, such as diminizide, chlormequat chloride, and simidol. We don't want to use ethifon because that is going to abort flowers, and when we're finishing these crops, we're trying to produce flowers, not abort them. So again, we want to focus on those PGRs that have the short to moderate residual generally. When we're looking at what we're going to use, again, we don't want to use ethifon because that's going to abort flowers. But we have ansimidol, chlormequat chloride, diminizide, florprimidol, paclobutrazol, and uniconazole available to us. If you want to make sprays, the best choices are going to be ansimidol, chlormequat chloride, and diminizide. These are the three PGRs that are going to be easiest to use, and by easiest mean have the least residual activity so it won't overregulate plants. So ansimidol, that would also be known as Arest or Abide, chlormequat chloride, which is Citadel or Psychocell, and diminizide, which is B9 or Dazide, are all great choices. The easiest of these three is going to be diminizide. Concentrations from 1,250 parts per million up to about 2,500 parts per million are going to be where you're going to want to look to for foliar sprays. If you do want to do a substrate drench to try and hold your plants and control some of that growth, a good choice is going to be Paclobutrazol. This is commonly available as Bonsai or Piccolo 10X as well. So again, low-dose drenches, Paclobutrazol is going to be what you want to use. Florprimidol or top floor and uniconazole or Sue Magic and Citadel. I'm sorry, Concise. Sue Magic or Concise. those are going to have too much activity and it's going to overregulate your plants. So I generally encourage people to avoid fluropyrimidol and uniconazole for drenches for holding crops during finishing. All right, so that's the majority of the talk that's going to focus on growth control. This last part of the talk is going to focus on managing the pH of your substrate for micronutrient availability, because while nitrogen and phosphorus are going to have a big impact on the growth of your crop and the size of your plant, it's going to be those micronutrients which are affected by substrate pH that really affect the leaf greenness or the appearance of your plant. So to start out with, again, I've talked about already how pH and micronutrients interact, so I just want to review how that happens. When we look across the range of pH in this figure from 4.0 to 8.0, and we look at the different macro and micronutrients, we look at the availability of them across the different pH ranges. And the availability is indicated by the width of the black bar. And what I'd really like to focus on is the micronutrients, and those are going to be at the bottom of the figure with the solid green bar. You can see that between those pHs that we normally see in greenhouse crop production, about 5.4 to 6.2, you can see that as the pH is on the lower end, or as it decreases, there is more micronutrient availability. But as the pH increases, you have less availability of micronutrients. So this is the relationship. The higher the pH, the less micronutrient availability. The lower the pH, the more micronutrient availability. In production, this is what we'll see. Calibrachoa is a plant that requires a low pH or has a high micronutrient requirement. When you have a high pH, you'll start to see this interveinal chlorosis. Again, this is something that's very common on lots of our vegetatively propagated annuals and perennials. Many seem to have a high micronutrient or high iron requirement. When it gets deficient, when it doesn't have enough, or when the substrate pH is too high and it limits the amount, then we're going to start to see the development of this chlorosis. Alternatively, there are some plants that are very efficient at taking up micronutrients, and these plants need fewer micronutrients, or they need a higher substrate pH that will limit micronutrient availability. The best example is going to be the zonal geranium. This is a plant that will start to develop marginal chlorosis and necrosis when you have a high pH, a different response from those low pH plants. So when we talk about micronutrient requirements, those plants that require a low pH, they either require more micronutrients, so they need a low pH to make them more available, or they're just simply inefficient at taking up micronutrients. So again, they need that low pH to keep a high concentration of micros around the roots. Alternatively, those plants that require a high pH, they either require less micronutrients or lower micronutrient concentrations, or they're just efficient at taking up micronutrients and again need that higher pH to restrict micronutrient availability. Again, this is crops that are going to vary in the requirements for pH, and this table just briefly summarizes plants and categorizing them by low, general, or high pH requiring crops. And again, on the low end, you see Calibrachoa, Pansy, Petunia, Snapdragon, plants that commonly get chlorosis under high pH conditions. Alternatively, geranium and marigold, those are the most well-known high pH crops. Now, we can select our fertilizer or modify our fertilizer plan to affect our substrate pH, because fertilizers affect the pH of our growing substrate. Some fertilizers increase the substrate pH, while other fertilizers are going to lower it. The degree of this change also varies. Some fertilizers have little influence on pH, raising or lowering it, while others have a much greater influence of this. Now, the cause of this pH change is the form of the nitrogen in the fertilizer, and this potential acidity or basicity can be explained by the nitrogen form. So here we have an example of how acid fertilizers change the pH. Those acid fertilizers are fertilizers that have a high proportion of ammonium or ammoniacal nitrogen in them. And what happens is that positively charged ammonium is taken up by the plant root, and in order to keep that root electrochemically balanced, the root kicks out a positively charged proton. What happens is that as the proton concentration increases, that drops the pH of our substrate, making it more acidic. We also see an acidic effect of ammoniacal nitrogen when it's converted to nitrate. You see that as the ammonium is converted to nitrate, another proton or positively charged hydrogen is generated and put into the substrate. Again, as there's more protons, the pH decreases, making the substrate more acidic. Nitrate is going to be the form of nitrogen that comprises the majority of nitrogen for those fertilizers that are considered basic. Just like the ammonium, we're trying to keep an electrochemically balanced route. So when the negatively charged nitrate is taken up, a hydroxyl ion is put into the substrate. As the concentration of hydroxyl ions increases, this is going to raise the pH of our substrate. Like I mentioned previously, these fertilizers are going to vary in their potential acidity or basicity. And this is expressed as the milliequivalents of calcium carbonate that it would take to equalize the fertilizer application for those acidic fertilizers, or the amount of calcium carbonate that the fertilizer is equivalent to for those basic fertilizers. And I've listed a range of fertilizers here in this table and provided the percentage of fertilizer in nitrogen, the percentage of fertilizer in ammonium, and then the corresponding potential acidity or basicity. Starting at the top of that list, we look at a 2177 acid special. This is going to be commonly used for finishing florist azaleas. You can see here there is no nitrate in this fertilizer, and it's 100% ammonium. That's why it's got the strongest or greatest potential acidity in this table, 1,539 milliequivalents. Now, as we go down and as the proportion of ammonium decreases and the proportion of nitrate increases, you can see that the potential acidity is starting to drop until we hit the 15020 fertilizer, where it has 77% of nitrate. And as we increase to the calcium nitrate with 100% nitrate, the potential basicity is increasing. And these are the fertilizers that are going to raise substrate pH. Now, generally speaking, potential acidity is stronger than potential basicity, or in other words, acid fertilizers are more effective at lowering pH than basic fertilizers are at raising pH. You can also get boosted micronutrient formulations. So just like we can change our pH to affect micronutrient availability, we can get different concentrations of micronutrients relative to nitrogen. Peat light formulations, for example, provide more micronutrients compared to traditional formulations. So when you compare a traditional 20-10-20 to a peat light 20-10-20, the peat light is going to have approximately 2 times the amount of micronutrients. You also see a fertilizer that's called boosted base, and this is going to be a formulation that has even more micronutrients than those peat light formulations. So you can use these peat light or boosted base formulations to provide even more micronutrients to ensure your plants stay green. They're also very useful when you're using low nitrogen concentrations, like we talked about earlier in the talk, in order to control growth. Using a peat light or a boosted base formulation will help you provide additional micronutrients at those lower nitrogen concentrations. So the take-home message for this talk is focus on nitrogen and phosphorus for your growth control. By modifying our nitrogen concentration and our phosphorus concentration, we're going to be able to manage more of that vegetative growth and stretch and try and hold back growth and reduce the need for PGRs without producing plants that have any unmarketable deficiency symptomology. Well, then when it comes to keeping your foliage nice and green, focus on controlling your substrate pH and an adequate micronutrient supply. That's going to help keep that color and appearance. If your head is spinning from all these recommendations, try to group your crops in order to simplify fertilization strategies. So you can group your crops by lower and higher nitrogen requirements and higher and lower pH or micronutrient requirements, just as a simple way to try and simplify fertilizing during production. All right, we'll be taking questions now from the audience, but if you have any questions outside of this presentation, I'd like you to please go ahead and email me at ccurrey, C-C-U-R-R-E-Y, at iowastate.edu, iastate.edu. Also, feel free to call my office, 515-294-1917. All right, with that, I thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.